Hello and welcome to the course Basics of Experimental Design for Cognitive Psychology. As I mentioned in this week 2, I will be giving us a broad survey of the different kinds of research design so that we are aware of the considerations that goes into each kind of research design, and we will also be able to make an informed decision about how and when or what kind of research design to choose that basically suits the kind of research questions that we are answering. Now, we are talking about descriptive research designs since the previous lecture, and one of the most important, one of the most widely used descriptive research designs is basically case studies. All right. So, case studies include data based on a very small set of individuals, sometimes just one or two individuals, which are selected on the basis of their unique characteristics. So, a case study approach is most important to uncover what is happening with a specific individual, and that specific individual is chosen because there are certain unique characteristics of these individuals, or they are undergoing certain unique let us say circumstances, or there is something very interesting that is to be understood, to be had when you are performing or when you are observing this case in extreme detail. For example, Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, used observations of his own children to develop the stage theory of cognitive development. I am sure all psychology students are aware of Piaget's theories of cognitive development, which is basically built on the basis of his observations of his own children and some around his house. Other famous examples, for example, include this study of the patient M. Leborgne, or more famously known as TAN, by Paul Broca, to develop detailed descriptions of what happens when the Broca's area, which is the inferior temporal area in the left hemisphere, is damaged, and it leads to corresponding difficulties in speech production. Okay. So, these kinds of situations are actually fairly unique, and they basically are potentially extremely informative about what happens when a particular instance happens. Say, for example, when a brain injury happens, what are the consequences, and you want to study all of these consequences in detail so that you can basically develop a particular theory about the processes involved. Let us say when Paul Broca came across this particular patient, he was only being able to say tan, tan, tan and a few expletives here and there, but was not able to produce coherent, grammatically correct speech. Once this person died, this was his skull was posthumously exhumed, his postmortem was carried out, histology was carried out on his brain, which revealed that this was the area of his lesion. So, that basically is an interesting aspect in terms of case studies. Now, while case studies are typically conducted, so as I said, case studies are typically conducted with individuals who have unusual or abnormal experiences and possess characteristics or are going through unique situations. The idea, as I said, is that the individuals will provide a detailed insight into statistically rare instances and be extremely informative about these processes or phenomena. One of the most famous proponents of the case study approach has been Sigmund Freud, who I always call the rock star of psychology, because he was a master of using the psychological difficulties of his patients, his individuals, to draw conclusions about basic psychological processes. Say, for example, his detailed descriptions about the subconscious and the unconscious mind, his detailed treatise on interpretation of dreams, on basically also the nature of personality, the id, ego and the superego kind of things. Most of these things were basically developed, most of these insights were developed through a series of case studies, which is basically individuals who were coming to him with particular kinds of psychological problems, particular kind of psychological difficulties, and Freud would take extensive interviews with these individuals and basically make these observations, later connect these observations with other cases, form a pattern, and that is basically what led to some of his most famous theories. An example could be the study of little Hans. Freud treated this little kid who was afraid of horses. Now, when Freud goes deep into how the child behaves and other basic details also about the family and stuff, he basically finds out that this fear of horses could be interpreted in terms of repressed sexual impulses towards the mother, fear of the father, and so on. So, again, we will not discuss the merits of what Freud was investigating and later interpreting as, but the idea is that case studies are extremely informative. They tell us something interesting, something unique about these statistically rare occurrences, and sometimes can also be connected across similar cases of a kind and be developed into theories. Other instances, and we will take some examples just to sort of drive home the point. Other cases of utilizing the case study approach is that of neurologists who use this approach to understand and investigate disorders of the brain and some injuries. Now, for example, Roger Sperry studied who are called split brain patients. These patients are those individuals who have had their two hemispheres surgically disconnected to prevent severe epileptic seizures. Now, when this phenomena was first observed, the people would survive, lead a relatively healthy life, so to speak, but very interesting behavioral patterns emerge. Say, for example, if you look at, and there are a bunch on YouTube, there are a bunch on cognitive neuroscience textbooks that you can find, the behavioral outcomes of split brain patients. Sometimes you will come across an individual who's seeing something here but not being able to name it, seeing something in the right visual field, able to draw but not name it, and so on. There are interesting anecdotal evidences. There are detailed documentations of what happens when, let's say, this bunch of fibers, the corpus callosum, are disconnected surgically, and the left and the right hemispheres are left to be on their own. They are not communicating with each other. All right. So, this has also been an interesting sort of collation of a bunch of cases with with patients who had their brains split, because that was the only surgical alternative to prevent epileptic seizures around the time. Now, another very important case in psychology, cognitive psychology in particular, was that of Phineas Gage. I am sure you would remember. If not, you can go and look at some of my previous lectures. Now, the Phineas Gage was basically a railroad worker, and he was basically pumping dynamite into the track, and they were basically trying to clear the stones and this and that. Once what happens is that he inserts an iron rod, but he fails to sort of take adequate precautions, and as the dynamite bursts, the iron rod basically enters through his through his cheek and sort of goes right through it, taking away a portion of the frontal cortex. Now, before this accident happened, Phineas Gage was supposed to be a likable, sociable worker, was very happy, very regular, had extremely nice relationships with people around, but once this accident had happened, his behavior changed drastically. Okay, a person who was once popular and sociable and was liked by all his colleagues, all his co-workers, was now uttering profanities, abuses, was not regular to work, was getting into fights a lot, and his behavior considerably changed. Now, neurologists basically found that this is interesting, that damage in a specific area of the brain is leading to changes in personality, and they made detailed attempts to study the behavior of Phineas Gage and learn about the role of the prefrontal cortex in managing social behavior. This is again a few cases that I am going to talk about. Another, if you remember, is the case of HM, a patient who was studied extensively by Professor Glenn Humphreys, the late Professor Glenn Humphreys, where what happened was similar to the split brain patients. A surgical alternative to prevent his epileptic seizures was followed. Now, what happens in the case of HM was that a part of his the hippocampus, which is area in the brain that is responsible for forming new memories, hippocampus both in the left and the right hemisphere was surgically removed, because that was probably near to the source of the epileptic seizures that this guy was happening. Interestingly, once this surgery was performed, the epileptic seizures stopped, but something very interesting happened. The ability of HM to form new memories completely vanished. He could remember everything in some to some degree prior to the operation, was not able to form new memories after the operation. So till the day he died, he could not really make memories and remember anything beyond a very small period of time, and therefore he became a source of curiosity for a lot of neurologists. He was studied extensively by Professor Glenn Humphreys, but several others also, who basically went to this guy, tested him across different range of scenarios, across different tasks in terms of different cognitive functions, to study what is the inseparable role of the hippocampus, not only in memory formation but in other cognitive functions as well. So in that sense, you can I think you can appreciate that case studies are extremely useful in getting us some idea of how things are, especially when there are instances which are statistically rare or unique. All right. Now, well, this is good. It is extremely important, and it yields a very interesting knowledge. There are certain disadvantages to the case study approach as well. For example, case studies are based on unique and often irreplicable experiences or situations of a very small set of individuals. Say, for example, if neurologists were to develop theories, or were to develop broader theories based on specific cases like that of Gage, or like that of TAN, or like that of HM, it will be very difficult to generalize this across patients. The first reason would be it is almost statistically impossible to have another individual have exactly same injury, say for example injury to the exact same coordinates of the brain. Also, we know that functional and structural connectivity of the brain differs across individuals. So if one were to develop theory about let us say the role of the prefrontal cortex in social behavior, it cannot be made just on one case alone. All right. So whatever we know about the prefrontal cortex and its role in social behavior is actually derived from a large number of case studies, large number of experimental investigations, neuroimaging investigations, and so on. Okay. So while a single cases are, or let us say 1 or 2 or 3 cases are extremely important, they may help inform us about, say for example, they can lead to certain hypotheses. The way people were performing experiments with Phineas Gage or with HM can actually be a source of certain hypotheses, which could then be tested in a range of normal individuals, or tested with other patients who may have injuries similar to those areas but not exactly those areas, because that is extremely rare. All right. So these instances, these cases, they cannot tell us much about whether the same experiences would manifest in other individuals as well in similar situations, or even it will be difficult for the case studies to tell us why the particular situation, the specific unique situation of a given individual is manifesting in the way it is. Okay, because there is a lot of details about the individual that has probably happened prior to the accident or prior to the surgery, and we don't really know. We know once this event has happened, these are the consequences. We don't know everything else about the individual from the past and so on. Also, there is no comparison group. So remember, when we want to make causal inferences, we want to have a comparison group, we want to have a control group, we want to have an experimental group, we want certain kinds of controls. All of that obviously is not possible with case studies. Okay. So there is no comparison group in these situations that did not experience the unique situations that these cases are experiencing, and therefore researchers cannot really determine how these individuals would be like if they were not having this unique experience. So again, it's very difficult to match two individuals on all situations. Okay. Now on top of that, this one individual has had this particular injury. You cannot really compare the two because there are too many variables in play. All right. Now, given that there are some advantages and some disadvantages to case studies and let us say observational research designs that we have talked about in the previous lecture, we can talk a little bit about how do people collect data, how do people organize data in these methods. So even though observational research designs and case studies provide a detailed insight into ongoing behavior, they may not often be as objective as one might like, or they might also be colored with, say for example, experimental bias, to be precise. So, as the observer has chosen which individuals to study, so this is extremely selective, the sampling is extremely selective. The observer has chosen which individuals to study, which behaviors to record or which to ignore, and also the method of how they will interpret these behaviors. Say for example, Sigmund Freud interpreted most of the problems of his patients in terms of unconscious repressed impulses. They could be sexual in some cases, they could be violent in some cases. Everything was in some sense broadly connected back to problems or traumatic experiences which were rooted in the past experiences, and in some sense repressed and logged back into the unconscious or subconscious mind. So, in that sense, what happens is that the generalizability, the scientific validity of whatever you are deriving from these observational research designs or case studies becomes extremely difficult. There is also a very interesting tendency. We have talked about Popper and we have talked about verification and falsification. A lot of times what you will see is the way people describe case studies is basically that they say, okay, I had this hypothesis when I was studying this case, and see this confirms my hypothesis. There is hardly scope to falsify anything in that sense, and in that also, as you might be aware by now, makes this whole thing a little bit weak, does not stand on proper scientific grounds. Again, another thing is that the data that is observed, that is basically being collected from these forms of research methods, can sometimes be extremely sketchy. It's unstructured, it's unorganized, it can just be in the form of field notes, things that you are listening to, making notes haphazardly sometimes, and they are not in that sense amenable to detailed analysis and assessment. Although very organized case studies have also been organized. We'll come to them in a bit. So, in a lot of cases, these problems can be overcome by using systematic observation and to create quantitative like measured variables. What are the things that you would want to sort of use to maximize the potential of these designs? One is systematic observation. For example, the researcher needs to specify ahead of time exactly which observations will be made on which people and in what times and places. So, in that sense, you already know what you are looking for. You are not there and collecting everything that is available. You are looking for something, you are doing some research, and in that research you know exactly what it is you are looking for. Rest of that is just junk data and will not be useful. So, these decisions, by the way, also are based on theoretical expectations. Say for example, if in today's time a patient presents himself or herself to a neurologist's door with a frontal cortex injury, the researcher, the neurologist will have years of theory to inform him what to expect and what not in that patient. Now, in that sense, the hypothesis that this neurologist or psychologist would form when they are testing this new patient will be informed by theory that has been accumulated over several years for that matter. Alright. So, these decisions about what to observe, who to observe, what specific things to observe, what times, what tasks and so on are based on theoretical expectations about the type of events that are going to be of interest. Specifically about the this specificity about the behaviors of interest has the advantage of both focusing the observer's attention on these specific behaviors and also reducing the mountains of data that might be collected if the observers were just randomly recording everything that they find. Another thing, in cases, for example, Pomeranz and colleagues who were basically interested in assessing how and when young children compare their own performance with other children, they wanted to do this study. So, what they did was, in this study, 1 or 2 adult observers sat on chairs and they basically adjacent to work areas or adjacent to next to the classrooms of elementary school children, and they were basically just recording everything on the laptops and about the behavior of the children. Now, see, what happens here is that even prior to starting this data collection, these researchers went in with specified behavioral categories which would later be used by the observers. So, for example, these guys know what they are observing for, number of instances or things like that. So, when these categories are formed before data collection based on theoretical predictions and based on previous theory, the researchers would have an idea about what do they observe in these children, what kind of behaviors they take note about, and what are the specific instances of those behaviors occurring. Also, the method of recording observations is important. So, what to observe and how to observe. How to observe is equally important. Say, for example, even before the researchers begin to record the behavior, the observers, or the researchers would have spent 3 or 4 days in the classroom learning, practicing and revising the coding methods, and also letting the children get used to their presence, so that the data collection exercise is uncorrupted. Okay, there is practice, there is something that you have sort of said, okay, when I was spending time with these children, I saw this, and then the researcher will say, okay, out of the 10 things you have listed, 4 are important. All right. As the coding categories were well defined in this Pomerantz and colleagues study, there was a very good inter-rater reliability. So, across these number of observers, they were basically reliably talking about the same phenomena, and also to ensure that this inter-rater reliability remains, the experimenters frequently carried out the reliability analysis on the codings that were being obtained over time, again and again, with every observation period, so that they know that the data is being collected is clean and it's correct. Now, this is extremely important because even in children's social behavior, for example, there are some behaviors that would occur more frequently, some would occur infrequently, and it is important to be sure that the behaviors are being coded in a reliable, in a systematic manner. Over the course of each observation period, for example, several types of data could be collected. For one, the observers encoded what is called event frequencies. For instance, the number of verbal statements that indicated social comparison. For example, statements like my picture is the best, or how many did you get wrong, or how many did you get right, things like that. So, where comparison is there, so you can tally them, you can say, oh, these are the instances at these times these two kids were comparing, and again depends on what kind of theoretical what framework you have gone in with. Also, the observers could code for, let us say, event duration, not only frequencies but also duration. For instance, the amount of time that the child was attending to their work versus the amount of time the child is attending to the work of others. So, finally, all the children were interviewed after the observation had ended, and this sort of closed the overall loop, and it provided rather systematic data to the observers, recorded well for subsequent analysis and interpretation. Another slightly equally important thing actually in terms of collecting observational data is choosing the kind of sample that you are targeting. What is your target population? What is the sample that you would go with? All right. So, for example, Pomerantz and colleagues used 3 basic sampling strategies to reduce the amount of data that they needed to record. First, they utilized event sampling. They focused on specific behaviors that were theoretically related to social comparison. Second, they employed individual sampling, that is, the observers were randomly selected. Observers typically selected one child to be observed during one observation period. Okay. So, which individual is being sampled for observation session number 1 or 2 or 20? What are the events within this individual that I am going to observe? And lastly, time sampling. Each child was observed only for a period of up to 4 minutes. So, in this 4-minute period, this is what the behavior of this particular child looked like, and then maybe his turn will come later. All right. Now, these data, you can see now the data that is going to come out will be extremely systematic. So, these data were coded as they were being observed, and the observed events could now be more precisely recorded as it was guided by theory, it was guided by particular sampling strategies. Finally, Pomerantz and colleagues actually found that the older children were basically using more subtle social comparison strategies, and they basically thought of social comparison or comparisons typically as boastful behavior or unfair behavior. So, you can see initially children are more innocent and they get into comparisons and this and that, but as they grow older, they get a sense of that this is unfair, this is boastful, and probably not socially accepted behavior. So, you can see using a systematic research design, even in observational studies, you can actually come up with interesting insights, useful insights with high reliability and validity. Okay. So, in that sense, what we have is a very good idea of how observational research or case studies can actually inform us, and what kind of insights can be gained from this. How can we, what are the basic concerns in coding data, in organizing it, interpreting it later, and analyzing it and interpreting it later. All right. So, thank you. I will talk to you about other research designs in the next lectures.